Emulation, seen by some as the national pastime of dirty dogs, it's seen by others as the national pastime of those who just want to play some darn games without this game costs how much? I just spent the last 3 months eating nothing but beans and rice to pay for Guardian Heroes. I don't think I have another 3 in me. I will say that over the years, people's stance on emulation has certainly softened up. The prices of certain games that used to be a lot cheaper years ago have become so expensive that it feels unrealistic to recommend people buy original hard copies of games, especially when the money isn't even going to the original creators anymore, and instead to eBay user Tricky Ricky 76. Purchasing my copy of Dragon Force helped somebody in Denver, Colorado buy a new lawnmower. You think that helps me sleep better at night? 'Cause it sure does. Alright, so if somebody wants to recommend that people play a game but knows it's unrealistic to suggest they consider the asking prices of hundreds of dollars, or heck, maybe even more, the alternative is often to recommend emulation, or just imply that we won't judge you if you were to use something like that. Although, considering the morality of it for some, one could argue emulation has a similar asking price. Free shipping though, but this is where it gets awkward. You're not allowed to play something you don't own for free without permission. Makes logical sense, but from a practical sense, it's kind of odd that paying for Tricky Ricky 76 in Denver, Colorado's lawnmower is the way around this. Of course, in some cases, you can indeed still pay the owners of that intellectual property by downloading the game off of a digital service if it's still available for purchase somewhere, and with the caveat of it's still emulation, which invites the question, what exactly is emulation and why do people think it's dirty? Well, emulation is often equated to playing games for free instead of paying for them, but that's just one of the ways it happens. Emulation is essentially just a way to run games without needing the original hardware by emulating the original hardware, or to put it even more simply, by imitating the original hardware to varying degrees of accuracy. So when you play something like a Super Nintendo Classic Edition, it's using emulation. This does not have all of this inside of it. Rather than having all these various parts, it has hardware that is powerful enough to emulate the games instead, which is often the cheaper and easier option, especially if the game is being released years after the original hardware was in production. The truth is, anyone who's been in this hobby has likely used emulation, whether they think they have or not. Yep, even with that sign you put on your front door. Emulation is all around us. Some folks will claim to not use emulation because they insist on always buying physical copies. Well, some physical copies use emulation. These arcade games aren't running off original arcade hardware, and they aren't ports either. A port is when a game has been modified to run natively on the new target platform, rather than emulate the original hardware. Funny enough, this Sonic Origins release has ports of the Genesis and Sega CD games, but then emulated versions of Game Gear games. Sometimes people prefer ports because it gives that version of the game its own flavor due to the changes made and potentially things added. I prefer the taste of Saturn over Switch in this case. However, sometimes people prefer an emulated version because they just want the game to run exactly like the original version did, or at least as close as possible, which depends on the quality of the emulation, which, like I said before, can vary. By far the most accurate type of emulation is what's referred to as FPGA, with the purpose of replicating the behavior of original hardware, often by reverse engineering the original hardware to really get in there deep and match things as closely as possible. And typically more accurately than regular emulation. Not easy to do, and often this is done by super dedicated fans in the name of preservation. So let's give those folks a round of applause. After all, preservation by means of various types of emulation is going to be the most likely way to preserve video games moving forward. Video games aren't like other forms of media such as music or movies where you can more or less convert them into a file and then play them with a wide variety of standardized software. Video games require their original, specific hardware to be emulated in one way or another. I mean, sure, your Sega Genesis has made it this far, but what about when you're gaming in a retirement home? Or when your future grandchildren are gaming in retirement homes? I'm telling you, retirement homes are going to have a much more positive reputation once video games become synonymous with them. And assuming that all these old games will still be available to play then, we need to make sure these games are playable forever. Emulation is the way, and the fact that we're technically dependent on the people who own the rights for them, which, by the way, involves a ton of different rights owners for a ton of different games. Yeah, it makes for one big giant mess. The suggested course of action is to what? Cross our fingers, waiting and hoping? That strategy typically hasn't worked out for me. I would pay whatever it costs right now for a way to purchase Cadillacs and dinosaurs, but I essentially don't even have the option to because the game has never been released outside of the original arcade cabinets. So technically, the only way I can play it is by finding one of those cabinets. And trust me, they're hard to find. I'd have an easier time finding an actual dinosaur. That said, as much as preservation will become more and more of a concern as the years go by, most hardware and games can be found in working condition as of right now. And because it's possible to still play games on original hardware, a lot of people still do. You're looking at one. This leads to one of the spicier points of contention when it comes to the emulation or not emulation debate. The experience of playing the games. Accuracy is a big point people bring up, and as somebody who plays mostly on original hardware, I'm just one opinion, but I don't think most people would even care or notice the difference if it was a blind test. Most people. Thing is, it rarely is a blind test. Does this look like a Super Nintendo to you? The lack of purple is how I can tell it's not. To me, the biggest difference you'll get with an original hardware setup is the controller you're using and the screen that the games are playing on. The things that give games that original feel, which, for those who care enough and have a preference for it, you can still use original controllers and CRT TVs with emulation. A lot of people just don't because it's not easy to do by default, like drinking enough water. Take it from me, I cancel plans with friends to spend half my day drinking and tinkling. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking right now. The controller and screen aren't the only things that give it that authentic feel. What about the eject button on the Super Nintendo? But in all seriousness, stuff like the eject button, the process of plugging in cartridges, the sound of the pin connector grabbing the pins, the flick of the power switch, the feeling of a game finally starting up for you.
Please, please, be good to me. Dad'em. Yes.
These are all things that can contribute to the magical feeling people are talking about when playing on original hardware. Naturally, fans of emulation may think, yeah, I'm doing okay without all that. Your loss, buddy. But for as much as playing on original hardware can provide people with sentimental, magical feelings, I've also seen people with similar levels of satisfaction for the rebellious feelings that playing these games without needing any of the original hardware gives them. I should also mention that some fans of emulation, in fact, many fans of emulation, will tell you that games look better with all the different visual filters and settings you can tweak when using emulators. Forget the types of setups that the original creators had in mind when they created them. You may just want to tweak things to your liking. A word of warning though, certain emulators can be tricky to get working at all. Typically, cartridge games work great, except N64 that's known to be suspect, and anything that uses a disc tends to be more difficult to get to work as well. So your mileage may vary depending how patient you are, or depending on how much experience you have dealing with this sort of thing. Also, I'm sure lots of folks will want to mention having save states with emulation, where you can save wherever you want. For what it's worth, many flash carts will allow you to do that while playing on original hardware as well. No more passwords, and am I the only one who confused my Faxanadu stage select password for my Netflix password? But there you have it, my breakdown of emulation. For a final answer, I think that emulation is indeed for everyone, even if the legal ways are the only ways you feel comfortable with. It still provides one more way that games can be played, and to me, the more opportunity people have to play video games, the better, especially as we move into the future. For this video's question, I'd ask you to feel free to share your thoughts about using emulation, while of course remembering to be respectful to other people in the comments, as you all usually do, and I thank you for. I personally have never cared how people play their games. I just really want people to play older games because I love them so much, and it's satisfying to see the joy they bring to other people. So, with that, leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.